Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, if you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Please also consider going to our website and donating $20.25 for our 2025 fundraising campaign. Visit the Film Florida merchandise page at filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. All merchandise proceeds go to the Film Florida Filmmaker Grant and Scholarship Fund. Jonathan Olsberg is the founder and executive chair of Olsberg-SPI, a leading international creative industries consultancy that specializes in the global screen production sector. For the last 30 years, Olsberg-SPI has helped clients plan, design, and deliver sustainable growth, evidence impact, and evolve and expand in a highly competitive and fast-moving screen sector. Jonathan's previous roles in production, distribution, and finance have facilitated SPI's practical understanding of the screen sector that helps deliver focused consultancy services to governments and businesses around the world. Jonathan is a member of the British Academy of Film and Television Arts, the British Screen Forum, and the European Film Academy. We cover a wide range of topics on this episode of the Film Florida podcast. Here's my conversation with Jonathan Olsberg. Welcome to the Film Florida podcast, Jonathan.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here and great to see you.
So let's kind of start at the beginning. Give your backstory. Help the audience get to know you a little bit.
Sure. As you can tell from my accent, I'm from England. I was born in London, although over the years I got US citizenship as well, so I'm a dual national. I grew up in London, and after school and high school there, I went into the finance industry as a chartered accountant. But after a few years of that, decided I wanted to continue with my sort of education, and I applied and got into Columbia to do an MBA, which I did from 1971 to 73, which was fantastic. And so that sort of very much turned me on to the US, in those days to New York. And I returned to the UK in 1973 and was in the finance industry in investment banking for the next 8 years, 4 of them in London, in the city. And then I came back to New York on Wall Street. The first part of my career was heavily in finance, but then I made a pretty dramatic pivot to the film industry.
And that's where I think your film career started, was your first role as an international sales agent in New York, moving to work in distribution and production over time. But what led you to that role specifically, and how did that kind of set your path in the industry?
Sure. Well, so this was in the early 1980s. And what was happening in the world of film was that around the world, new avenues for audiences to see film content that normally would only be seen in the cinemas was opening up with either home video tape or cable TV.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the early 80s, I was looking for a new career move. My British bank wanted to haul me back to London to stop having such a good time and get more serious. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to stay in New York. So I decided to move from being a banker into being an entrepreneur. And having spotted that the market, the avenues for people to see film content was expanding, I created with a friend of mine who knew a bit about the business, because I knew nothing about it, created an international sales company called Affinity Enterprises. And we were sort of embedded in what I would call in those days the sort of New York new wave filmmaking community. We managed to get a representation of some very, very ultra low budget movies coming out of students who are graduating from the NYU Film School and Columbia and other places. And we basically bootstrapped our way into creating this little business that was negotiating international distribution deals for these films, largely based on our ability to market them and show them in international film festivals. And so that was the niche, and started the business I think it was in 1982, tiny, working out of this spare bedroom in my business partner's apartment on the Upper West Side. But we had a pretty exciting start, even if the company was very small, because in early 1982, we were representing a film called Smithereens by a writer-director called Susan Seidelman. And this was her first film. It was a graduation film, shot on 16. She came out of NYU, made it for about $80,000, I think. We saw this film and really liked it and thought it had potential. And it coincided with a visit to New York from the Cannes Film Festival Scouts.
Mm-hmm.
And to cut a long story short, the film was invited into the Director's Fortnight in May 1982, which was tremendously exciting. Then we got a phone call about 2 weeks later from the festival. We thought, oh, this is bad news. They confused us with something else. They're going to withdraw the invitation. But actually, what happened was the full committee for the official competition saw the film, and we were bumped up from Director's Fortnight into full competition. So it was an incredibly dramatic moment, because we really had very little idea of what we would do. But there we were with a film competition within a few months of starting the business. And yeah, it was a memorable time.
Now, fast forward a little bit, you helped create Dakota Films in 1992 to produce high quality, independent, director-driven films such as Oliver Parker's Othello. Talk about Dakota Films and Othello, and touch on that focus of director-driven films. What does that mean?
Well, this all started with back in the early 80s, when we were representing films by people like Susan Seidelman and John Sayles, Henry Jaglom, and others. So we got to understand the market around the world for these very specialized cultural but commercial pictures. And so that's the track that I was on. And during the later 80s, I ran a distribution company in New York that handled international foreign films as well. So when I came back to the UK in 1990, I was working in international sales for Terry Glinwood, and handled The Last Emperor, which was an Oscar-winning film. But I decided after a while that I wanted to get into the business of independent production myself, and the world that I knew was this world of writer-directors, sort of auteur-writer-directors. And I was lucky to find in London at the time there were a reasonable number of such folk, including Oliver Parker. His first film was Othello. He through a friend brought us the script of his adaptation, and I thought it was terrific. I was in partnership with Luke Rogue, who's the son of Nicholas Rogue, and we created Dakota Films together. And yeah, we found that we thought Othello had legs. We managed to help it get financed, and took it out and sold it on the international sales sort of circuit.
Instant success almost.
Yes, it's we've had instant success. I reflect that I've had that on 2 occasions when I've started something new.
Yeah.
But each time I had to wait quite a long time for the
Yes.
next episode. It's quite, it's not necessarily always such a good thing to have a success the first time.
Right.
Because we, as you know, we all learn from our failures.
Right, of course. Now, you founded Olsberg-SPI in 1992, I believe, and today it's considered one of the leading consultancies for creatives in film, television, video games, and digital media. Tell me about how the company came to be, and talk about the growth as you have remained a leader in strategic practices for all these years.
Well, it was about the same time when I started Dakota Films with Luke. I also felt that I wanted to, I noticed actually that in London, in Europe, the governments were getting much more interested in what hitherto had been only a cultural activity, which was supporting, filmmaking. So at that time, the media program in Europe was getting started. It was a very substantial fund to stimulate and help to pay for the training of creatives, the international distribution of content. and also a couple of other things. And so I thought that, hang on a second, with my business background and my finance background, but also my understanding of how creative people work, because I'd learned that over the previous 10 years, I decided to start this company, which is, just me and then someone else at the beginning. But we basically grew on the back of understanding and being able to communicate how governments and film institutes and film commissions and others, how they they spotted the opportunity to get involved in this growing sector. And over the 33 odd years since then, we've managed to sort of stay within our guardrails, not be tempted to move as a consultancy into too many other areas, and have managed to specialize in, yes, the creative industry as a whole, but really most of the work is in film, TV, digital media, video games, etc. And we've managed to surf the growth wave of these industries and also internationalize our business quite considerably. So nowadays, although we're based in the UK, we've got about 14 or 15 people, I would say 95% of our revenues come from outside the UK and
Okay.
in most corners of the world.
One of the things you guys focus on is screen tourism or film tourism. It's a popular concept that has come to the forefront of the film industry in recent years. Talk about some of the key benefits of film tourism and how specific jurisdictions worldwide have been able to maximize some of those impacts.
Gradually, the awareness has grown of the connectivity between a kind of a desire of a jurisdiction to get more tourists, and there's also a desire of that jurisdiction to have more of its heritage, stories, locations, people shown on the screen and seen around the world. And as once we entered the global sort of streaming environment, where became a lot easier for content to be seen globally very quickly, it became clear that these were two industries that had a lot of connectivity. Just for example, the activities of a tourism office for a country, in terms of marketing that country and trying to attract folks to come there, very similar to the activities of a film commission, whose job is to try and market that country specifically to production entities so that they will come and spend money there. We find quite often that film commissions around the world are often embedded in the tourism and economic development ministries of wherever they happen to be. But I suppose one of the most celebrated examples of the screen tourism phenomenon is in New Zealand with Lord of the Rings and many other Peter Jackson films. They were all, made in New Zealand, taking advantage of phenomenal natural locations. And none of the content, if you watch it, has anything to do with New Zealand.
Right.
So unless as an audience member sitting in Tampa or wherever, unless you found out, you might be intrigued by where this is shot and really want to know more about it. But you had to rely in those days on the efforts of the tourism agencies, and then social media took over to figure out, well, where in the world is that? I want to go there. And so this phenomenon, which we call screen tourism, developed, and that's several attributes about it that make it very interesting for governments and locations. We did a piece of work in Northern Ireland, in Belfast in particular, for Visit Northern Ireland, about Game of Thrones and what was the tourism effect of having Game of Thrones there and how to maximize it. And we found that there were a lot of people who were coming to Northern Ireland as tourists. And in those days, 10 years ago, other than going to Belfast, Northern Ireland really wasn't on the tourism map. But because there are so many iconic scenes and locations in the film, which everybody knew were in Northern Ireland, a lot of visitors would come up. But they would come up just for the day from Dublin or somewhere. So actually, they were aware that the locations were in Northern Ireland. They wanted to go there, but they whizzed in and out on a bus tour, seeing 4 or 5 locations, and hardly spent any money. So our advice was to start to create more visitor attractions that were connected to the content and that gave visitors, tourists, more reason to hang around and spend money. And one of the interesting things we found out about the nature of these tourists compared to the average tourist is people who are going to a location because they've seen it in a story or in a documentary or even in a reality show like Survivor in Fiji, for example.
Mhm.
These tourists like to stay, they like to move around, they're usually reasonably well heeled, and they tend to spend a lot of money, and they also act as advocates or ambassadors for wherever they've seen. We did a study in Barcelona based on Vicky Cristina Barcelona, which was, I think, on Woody Allen, so I can't quite remember. But they wanted to know, well, what was the screen tourism effect? And we found it was very strong. And at that point, the mayor of Barcelona was almost wanted to shut off the tourism tap because the tourists they were getting were young people with no money or cruise ship visitors who came in for half a day and then didn't stay. Whereas we found that screen tourists stayed around, stayed for days, moved around, spent more money, and had this sort of advocacy role. And that's, I think, this unusual relationship is something that's thrived and also has a connection with another area of value in production that some governments like to see. They like to see their people, their stories, their heritage locations on the screen, and they want it to be seen around the world. And the aspect of this that people call soft power also has emerged, which is to say, in terms of international trade or just geopolitical awareness, a strong film that people love about where you are, about where your government is catering for, can be a very powerful tool.
Yeah. Well, in a previous episode of our podcast, we had Stefan Roche from New Zealand on to talk specifically about film tourism and screen tourism. And so, I mean, we're seeing a thread here. It's not just a tourism thing. It's not just an economic development thing. It's not just a film thing. They're all kind of intertwined together.
Exactly. And I'm sure Stefan, who's a global expert in this field, will have said that more and more the producers of the content, especially if they're large international companies, understand the value of screen tourism and want to tap in to the tourist interest that is also essentially interest in seeing their content.
Right.
So there's this connectivity I've talked about exists on a number of different levels.
Right, right. Now, your company also identifies and measures the cultural and social value of screen production in given regions. What were some of the main findings that you've learned about and trends from some of that research?
Part of our work with governments, we're often asked to quantify or describe in robust evidence terms the value to the public purse of investing in this sector. And I think on our website we've got a recent example of this, which is from Ireland itself, which is essentially a report on what we call the cultural dividend of the industry, and in this case particularly of the Irish production incentive. And what we found, because there was a production incentive that was encouraging productions in Ireland, that a high proportion of the projects that were accessing the incentive had Irish settings or were based on Irish source material and also employed many, many Irish people. And even if the setting of the story isn't Ireland, these sorts of benefits would accrue. Also, in this particular case, Ireland has its own Gaelic language, and the incentive supports content in that language. And this played a key role in encouraging and promoting and preserving the Irish language, particularly for younger people being, frequent users of screen content rather than necessarily reading books in Gaelic. This was an avenue for them to get to understand better some of the cultural heritage. And there are other aspects of it. Animation is a particularly potent sector to show the cultural elements and social elements of stories from a particular part of the world. And other kind of aspects of value that isn't just about the actual spend or the return on investment, sort of bleed over to the fact that the workers in our industry the jobs are very, very highly valued. The workers are well compensated. We found that people in our industry who worked in the industry were very proud of the fact that they do that, and that was communicated to their social network. Yeah, Irish crew took real pleasure in their work and found what they did was very meaningful. We found that out through a particular survey that we did. So there are quite a number of aspects of cultural and social value that can't be enumerated in the same way that economic value
Right.
can, because the data, the underlying data is just different. But again, governments around the world are recognizing this sort of range of this suite of benefits that our world can deliver.
Yeah. And now you guys have also started doing some work in Africa and the Middle East. What are your thoughts on the growth of the industry in these parts of the world? And talk about how, some of that opportunity for domestic and inward productions comes
Mm.
into play as well.
Well, we've been looking at them working in the Middle East for quite a while, and it's a very, very unusual and special part of the world, and quite different from Africa, and I'll come on to explain that. So the Middle East is a large area, a lot of people, a lot of young people, in a relatively wealthy part of the world. So it's a place where content is consumed, is already evident, but more and more people from that part of the world want to see their own stories on screen, as well as, portable, international, high value stories from here or from wherever it may be. So several countries have started to look into how to create their the strategies to build their own industry, and that's what's been happening. I think in terms of, before I come on to Africa, in terms of its relevance and opportunities for domestic and inward production, I think it's early days to see what that connectivity might be. But what I would say is that the Arab world has a huge diaspora. And I don't know much about the Arabic filmmaking community in Florida, but I would think that it could be surprisingly substantial. And there may be some cooperation or co-production possibilities for filmmakers in Florida from that background to collaborate with some of the emerging countries in the Middle East that are interested in making content that works globally. As far as Africa is concerned, our work in Africa came along by virtue of our relationship with the World Bank. The World Bank has a unit called the International Finance Corporation. The IFC's job is to help developing countries and parts of the world in creating new commercial and industrial activity. Hitherto, they've not really looked at our industry or the creative industries as a whole very much, but they decided that the creative economy was worth looking at, and particularly for Africa with so many young and creative people. So we were hired to do some analyses of different countries in Africa and how those industries might increase and expand. So that's what we've been doing. Regarding connecting here with domestic and inward productions, I don't see many obvious avenues yet to collaborate on inward productions. I would have thought Latin America might have more sort of opportunities there. But again, culturally, thinking of diaspora, I think there are opportunities at film festivals and other similar events to bring really interesting African filmmakers here and create a dialogue. And who knows what that could lead to, because it's such an expanding part of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you are also regularly invited to speak at film markets, conferences, seminars, including some of the biggest and best conferences in the world. How have you seen the industry and the needs of industry workers evolve in your appearances at these events throughout the years?
Well, I think in the last 10 to 15 years in particular, and this is something I mentioned earlier, governments responsible for the economies and the cultural life of countries have realized the value of the film production sector and film, TV, digital media, whatever it is, screen-based content, and how this is a totally globalized industry. I mean, I can't think of any other industry where a relatively small business unit, like an independent producer, might be able to manufacture something, piece of content, obviously, in one corner of the world, and if it succeeds, have it available to be seen by audiences online, probably, or on TV, or maybe through the cinema, all over the world. And it's a phenomenal opportunity. And I think the globalization of our industry is certainly something. And government understanding of the value that I've mentioned, economic, cultural, social. But there's been an increased sophistication of the tools and measures that governments can use. And we're all being familiar with the world of incentives and tax credits. That's something, as you know, that our firm specializes in. We publish every 6 months a free publication, which is called our Global Incentives Index, and it describes the details of now over 120 incentives, national mostly, a few regional ones around the world. And when we started that publication, it was, we were scrabbling to find 80, and that wasn't that many years ago. But the incentive is a very effective tool for governments to use to invest in the sector and see immediate returns. And more recently, we've had the whole AI phenomenon, which has created quite a bit of tumult in the industry. Folks are still trying to work out, what does it all mean and how is it going to affect our lives? We're involved in quite a few projects that are seeking to answer those questions. And the landscape is by no means clear. The crystal ball is not at all clear in terms of macro impact, but definitely the use of AI and the tools available to below the line workers in particular can help a lot in creating new opportunities and improving the chances of people entering the sector and being able to sort of scramble up the ladder relatively quickly. I'm not referring here to anything involving above the line activity, which is obviously got a completely different and high profile and dramatic, set of circumstances.
What is the importance of developing national and regional sectors in our industry, in more traditionally underrepresented areas? How do you work to promote the sustainability of these sectors?
Well, there's a couple of things that I would refer to. In terms of sustainability, we have written a report recently for the AFCI, the Association of Film Commissioners International, on kind of best practice in sector development, public policy. And there's a whole chapter on sustainability there. And what we found through, and that's a publication that's available for free on our website. It's kind of like a playbook public policy initiatives, if you like. And the findings regarding sustainability was that the most important element of what to do to improve situation is that it needs to be a coordinated approach, a sort of constructive collaboration among various elements of the production sector, vendors, services, production facilities, the production community workforce. It needs everybody to be on the same page. And there are some ideas in that report of particular policies, but also alignment across the supply chain. So when you're thinking about sustainability, if you look at the supply chain, it's relevant in very many of the elements and steps in the supply chain. And the conversation between those entities about how to maximize sustainability is very, very important. You talked a little bit about indigenous issues. I'm thinking we've recently completed a study for the Arctic indigenous audiovisual sector in Canada. There's an international Arctic Indigenous Film Fund, which supports filmmakers who work in the Canadian Arctic region. And we found that there was substantial potential and opportunity for growth, and that when you have a regional entity that's very, very focused and knowledgeable about its clientele, if you want, and if they're able to focus specifically on a small number of initiatives, often that could be far more successful than trying to spread, limited resources around too broadly. But I think that it's a theme, I guess, in my conversation, which is about governments and public entities and them realizing how important this sector is and can be. The evidence is that a jurisdiction that wants to improve its success in film production and wants to thrive, with the right kind of policies, the win can be very quick compared to other elements of industry, where often investing in an industry can take many, many years and lots of money. In terms of our industry, it's not unless you're building some massive sound stages, and unless you're making, a blockbuster movie, it's not necessarily a big. It doesn't suck up a lot of financial resources, and decisions can be made very quickly sometimes, and activity happens, and all the benefits of that accrue. So I think that the ability of regional screen sectors to be more fleet of foot and focus in certain limited areas is one of the advantages there.
Now, we've talked a little bit about, the evolution of the industry, but talk a little bit about the development and investment in filming locations and how people have put so much energy into that part of the industry.
It really depends on the nature of the location. If you think about it, if you're a film commission that's promoting your area, your region, it starts with, well, what is it that we've got that filmmakers want? So it may be an urban and city environment that's relatively generic. So if there was a production that was actually set in, in New York or Chicago or LA or somewhere, you might easily be able to find the location much closer to home in a much less expensive area. So I think the ability to understand the value of the particular location is key. And one of the things we've noticed with the growth in reality shows, and particularly reality shows set in exotic locations, it's surprising the number of relatively small islands that are all around the world that have suddenly become hotbeds of production activity where you would never have thought that would be the case. I've just come back from a small Caribbean island, I can't say which has got 55,000 people, whose economy is based on tourism. 65% of the economy is tourism. They're struggling to find anything else to grow, but they realize, hang on, we've had some interesting commercials come here out of the blue. There was this, drama series coming from the UK, and without a film commission, and this place, with our help, has understood, wow, there's an opportunity here. If we create a very modest film commission, if we put a not very expensive but well-structured incentive in place, there's a lot of business we can take. And we were just in the Philippines doing some work there. I mentioned Fiji. We've worked in Cayman Islands and Malta, in any number, Mauritius. So this idea of a beautiful, whether it's jungle or tropical, or whether it's super luxury situations of building and villas, there's interest from production companies around the world, particularly in the unscripted area, of looking at new vistas and new places that the audiences haven't yet become tired of. And I think that's just going to increase and increase.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of beautiful locations, let's focus on Florida for a minute. I know you're
Yes,
fond of the
absolutely.
state and you spend a good amount of time here. Let's talk a little bit about incentives. As we all know, currently Florida has a number of local incentive programs, but lacks a statewide program. From your perspective, talk a little bit about the benefits and the advantages of filming in Florida when you look beyond just the financial incentives part of the conversation.
Well, I'm that much of a fan of Florida that I've actually moved here. So I now live in St. Petersburg. I'm a dual national, so even though I sound strange, I feel very much part of the environment. I mean, look, John, this is very much your expertise more than mine, and your work is totally embedded in this sector. One of the things that's interesting about Florida, first of all, it's a big place. There's a lot of people.
Right.
A lot of people from all over the world that look like they're from all over the world. And that's always a big draw when you're presenting the attributes of a potential filming destination. You've also got tremendous rural, marine and other locations that you can present, as well as some very big and interesting urban environments. As a state that's been handling the hospitality offers through your Whereas theme parks and everything else over the years, you already have here in Florida, there's already, I've found anyway, an attitude to kind of open your arms, say, come here, we'll look after you, we'll make sure you get what you want. And believe me, that does not exist in everywhere else. I'm not going to mention where, but we've been working in like a dozen different states around the country in the last 2 years, and there's definitely here in Florida a much more positive general view. Also, geographically, you're located next to a very fast-growing parts of the world in Latin America, and to a lesser degree, the Caribbean. But as you say, you don't have a state film office anymore, or currently, and you don't have an incentive. Incentives are the primary tool that can be used to help this industry thrive. Quite often there's a conversation with a jurisdiction that's looking at incentives for the first time and thinking, well, we've got so many other mouths to feed and other places where we have to spend our budget in healthcare and education, housing, whatever it may be. We can't really afford to take money away from them. To which the answer is, it doesn't mean, if you're having an incentive, that you're actually taking money away, because the way in which most incentives work, by the time the incentive is paid out, which is many a months after the production is completed, the production, if it's an additional production which wouldn't have come to Florida or been shot in Florida anyway, has spent so much money in the economy that would not have been spent otherwise. That additional economic activity usually is more than sufficient in economic terms to pay for or counterweigh the cost. I mean, usually the return on investment is very much greater than that. So, it seems to me that, I mean, I didn't come and live here because I thought my job is to help create an incentive at all. But it feels like also Florida's history and ability with its crew that has, was very busy here as a whole. Then, when changes took place here, then sort of went off to Atlanta or wherever else they went, clearly interested in coming back. And also you've got cities who are paddling their own canoe, and like Fort Lauderdale, Miami-Dade, and others. There are quite a few others. And around the world, the ability of cities to create incentives quickly, easily, and cheaply and get a result has encouraged lots of other places to do that. We worked at the end of last year in Oakland, helping them put a city incentive in place. So I think there are loads of advantages of film in Florida, which I know, John, you're totally on top of. And so I'm not talking necessarily about Florida, but where we're involved in a jurisdiction that is interested in looking at growing this industry, possibly creating an incentive, it takes quite a bit of explanation of how incentives work to bring legislators over the line and help them understand. And that report I mentioned before, the AFCI, the best practice report, and a report we did showing how during COVID, film production was so good for economies. And they're on our website. They've got evidence in there of when a production comes in, how the money is spent throughout the economy, not just in the film production business, and the jobs that are created and the profile that's created and the general economic benefits. So that's all there and available, and encourage your listeners and others to have a look if they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Along with everything else that we've talked about, you're also a member of the British Academy of Film and Television Arts, BAFTA, and as well as the British Screen Forum and the European Film Academy. What has your time with these esteemed organizations been like, and how have you seen the British film industry shift over that time?
I'll come on to the British film industry. The great thing about being involved in these entities, and it feels to me like maybe there's some version of a Film Florida Academy, if it doesn't already exist, that might be helpful. But it's all about networking and communication and information gathering, and using other members' knowledge, which they're always willing to give for free. So all these organizations have different meetings and forums and get-togethers, and many of them are put out on social media. And that the value to me of that is, let's share information. We're in a fantastic business, not that well understood. quite a few challenges, very global. How can we put our heads together to come up with solutions to help us all thrive? And thriving is really what SPI wants to see happening everywhere. In terms of the UK, we've been very, very successful as a place for international mobile productions to locate. We've got a really good incentive structure, tax relief, delivers value to the producer on some elements like above the line costs, some above the line costs that other jurisdictions don't give. We've been making movies for Hollywood for 85 or for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got excellent infrastructure and crew and workforce, and it's quite substantial. So our volume of that inward investment has rocketed in the last 10 years. There was a couple of bumps along the way with COVID and obviously with the strikes, but
Right.
we're as it has been everywhere, but we're getting back on track. However, the challenge has been more in the UK with the independent filmmaking community, of which I used to be a member, because inevitably there's a squeeze on resources, there's a squeeze on capacity, on crew, on talent, and that's an issue that's been a problem. It's being addressed in a number of different ways, including workforce development and including a recent change to the UK tax relief, which has made it increasingly valuable for independent producers, much more than the regular incoming production. In strategic terms, having a government policy that recognizes the essential symbiotic relationship between domestic and international productions, which we're great protagonists of. That's why it's so important.
Yeah. Now, Jonathan, you've touched on a lot of reports you guys have done, a lot of information, a lot of resources. Where can people learn more about you and Olsberg-SPI? Are there websites? Are there social media accounts? Where should people go to look?
So our website, it would be the first place to look, www.o-spi.com. We've got a Facebook page. We have a LinkedIn page. If you want to pitch me an email, very simple. It's Jonathan, Jonathan, at o-spi.com. And I'll arrange for you to receive whatever information you want. We've got a sign up link whereby you would get all of our reports if you signed up for it. That's on our website and on my email as well. So, and it's been wonderful for us. We're very lucky to work in this industry. We're very lucky to work globally. That's one thing that COVID taught us, is that we could work in New Zealand even if we were stuck in our home in London or in St. Petersburg or wherever. So it's been quite thrilling and rewarding, and we love to talk about it, and we love to share whatever we can with people. If you have a look at our website, have a look around. I think people will find lots of things which they'd be interested in.
Yeah, I can't suggest it enough. There is a lot of great resources there. So you're right, everybody should reach out. Jonathan, we appreciate you spending time with us today to share your story and your expertise. And we especially appreciate your friendship and your support to all of us here in Florida. Thanks for being on the Film Florida podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org and like or follow our social media pages. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Please also consider going to our website and donating $20.25 for our 2025 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator-spring.com, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.